It was 2 weeks before Christmas. The shelves were still full. The toys were still there. Action figures, board games, remote control cars still in their boxes. Price tags still attached. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, the same way they had hummed in every KB Toys store in every mall in America for the past 30 years. But taped to the front window, in letters that no one who worked there wanted to read, was a sign. Going out of business. All sales final. December 2008, not after the holidays, not in January, when the returns piled up and the markdowns began, right now. 2 weeks before the biggest toy selling day of the year, KB Toys, 461 stores, 87 years of American retail history, the store where millions of American children pressed their faces against the glass and dreamed, was dying in real time. The question is not just how a toy empire disappears. The question is who let it happen, and why no one stopped them. Pittsfield, Massachusetts sits in the far western corner of the state, tucked against the Berkshire Hills, far from Boston, far from the money and the attention that the rest of Massachusetts tends to attract. In 1922, it was a working mill town. Paper factories, electrical plants, the kind of place where men showed up before sunrise and left after dark, where families built their lives around what the factories needed them to do. It was here, on April 1st, 1922, that two brothers named Harry and Joseph Kaufman opened a wholesale candy store. They called it Kaufman Brothers. They sold candy and soda fountain supplies to small retailers across the region. Penny candy, hard sugar drops, the kind of confections that filled glass jars on drugstore counters and 5 and dime shelves. It was not a glamorous business. It was not a large business. It was two brothers, a modest operation, and a region full of small shops that needed a reliable supplier. For 2 decades, that was enough. Then the war came, and with it, the sugar shortages. The federal government rationed sugar during World War II, and the candy business, which ran entirely on the availability of cheap, abundant sugar, became something close to impossible. The Kaufman brothers needed a way forward. The way forward came, as so many things do in business, from someone else's misfortune. During the early 1940s, one of Kaufman brothers' clients, a small wholesale toy company, fell behind on its payments. The debt mounted. The client could not pay. And so, in the manner of creditors everywhere, Harry and Joseph Kaufman took what they were owed in the only currency available. They accepted the toy company itself as payment. It was not a calculated pivot. It was not a visionary moment of strategic reinvention. It was two men accepting a box of toys because someone owed them money and had nothing else to give. But the timing was extraordinary. On September 21st, 1946, Kaufman Brothers opened a wholesale toy store at 70 Columbus Avenue in Pittsfield. American soldiers were coming home, families were forming. The post-war consumer economy was just beginning to take shape, a vast, hungry, optimistic engine that would spend the next 3 decades buying everything that manufacturers could produce. Toys were part of that engine. Children were everywhere, and their parents, who had lived through depression and war, wanted to give them something better, something bright, something that felt like the future. By 1948, the candy business was finished. The Kaufman brothers closed that chapter entirely and devoted themselves to toys. What had started as a default, an inherited company, an accidental industry, became a calling. The first retail store came in 1959 in Connecticut. For years, the company had operated as a wholesaler, supplying toys to other retailers rather than selling directly to the public. But the Kaufman family understood something that many wholesalers of that era were beginning to realize. The real money, and the real connection to the customer, happened at the point of sale. It happened in the store, on the floor, face to face with the parent holding a child's hand. By 1973, Kaufman Brothers had made the full transition. Wholesale was done. The company relaunched as KB Toy and Hobby, a retail chain built specifically for the shopping mall, that new American institution rising across the suburbs, that cathedral of commerce where post-war prosperity went to spend itself on a Saturday afternoon. The Kaufman brothers could not have known what they were building, but they were building something that would one day reach into every corner of the country and into the memory of nearly every American child alive. There is a specific memory that millions of Americans carry, though most have never thought to name it. You are a child. You are in a mall, the smell of soft pretzels and department store perfume, The echo of footsteps on tile, the distant sound of a fountain. Your parents are somewhere nearby, moving at the slow, purposeful pace of adults who have errands to run. And then, at the end of a corridor, between a shoe store and a card shop, you see it. The sign, the colors, the window packed so densely with toys that it looks less like a store display and more like a fever dream of everything you have ever wanted. KB Toys. You press your face against the glass. That moment, that specific unrepeatable moment of childhood want, is what KB Toys sold, not the toys. The moment. Through the 1970s, as American suburbs expanded and mall construction accelerated across the country, KB grew with a speed that surprised even its own management. In 1973, when the company made its full pivot to retail, it operated just 26 stores. By 1979, that number had climbed to 170, spread across the Midwest and the East Coast, anchored inside the shopping malls that had become the new center of American community life. The formula was precise, and it worked. KB Toys did not build large stores. Where Toys R Us operated cavernous warehouse-style superstores on the outskirts of town, KB carved out compact, densely stocked spaces inside the mall itself, typically 2,000 to 3,000 square feet, packed floor to ceiling with product, positioned exactly where foot traffic was heaviest. The idea was not to be the biggest toy store. The idea was to be the most convenient one, the one you passed on the way to everywhere else, the one where an impulse became a purchase, became a memory. The stores had a particular atmosphere that is difficult to describe to anyone who did not experience it and impossible to forget for anyone who did. The aisles were narrow. The shelves were high. Every square foot carried merchandise: Star Wars figures, Barbie playsets, Hot Wheels tracks, board games stacked in columns that seemed to reach the ceiling. During the Christmas season, the density became almost overwhelming. Product pressed against product. Every surface covered. The store itself humming with the particular electricity of children who understood that everything they wanted was within arm's reach. The employees knew the regulars. In smaller markets, the KB store in the local mall was the only dedicated toy retailer for miles. Parents came in not just at Christmas, but through the year, for birthdays, for rainy Saturday afternoons, for the small rewards that punctuate a child's life. The staff knew which kids were saving up for which item. They held things behind the counter. They called families when a restocked shipment came in. This was not a corporation behaving with warmth. This was a retail operation that had, almost accidentally, become part of the fabric of the communities it served. In 1981, the Kaufman family sold the chain to Melville Corporation for $64.2 million. At the time, KB operated 210 stores. The sale was the natural endpoint of a family-built enterprise reaching the limits of what family capital could sustain. Melville brought resources, infrastructure, and the operational muscle to accelerate what the Kaufmans had started. Under Melville, the expansion continued. The name was standardized. Marketing became more sophisticated, and the chain that had started with two brothers and a box of inherited toys became a genuine national institution. By 1990, KB toy stores crossed the $1 billion mark in annual revenue, 13,000 employees, stores in malls from Maine to California, a brand that parents trusted and children adored. At its peak, in the closing years of the 1990s, KB Toys operated 1,324 stores across all 50 states, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Annual sales reached $1.8 billion. The company employed 16,000 people, not in a single factory, not in one city, but in 16,000 jobs spread across the country, in every mid-sized city and suburban corridor where a mall had been built and families had come to shop. It was, by any measure, one of the great retail success stories of post-war America. And the Christmas seasons were something else entirely. From the week after Thanksgiving through December 24th, KB Toys stores operated in a state of controlled chaos that its employees would remember for the rest of their lives. Shipments arrived daily. Shelves were restocked overnight. Seasonal workers, many of them mothers of young children, many of them teenagers earning their first paycheck, poured into the stores to handle the volume. The line at the register ran to the back wall. Managers worked doubles. The stockroom, always cramped, became a maze of open boxes and packing materials that no one had time to break down. Outside, in the mall corridors, the foot traffic swelled to numbers that the rest of the year never approached. Grandmothers with lists, fathers who had waited until the last week, children dragging parents by the hand toward the window display that had been rebuilt just for the season. Inside KB Toys, in that narrow, overstuffed, fluorescent-lit space, something real was happening. Families were building the memories that would last their children's entire lives. None of the people working those Christmas shifts, restocking shelves at midnight, counting inventory at 6 in the morning, smiling through the 10th hour of a holiday rush, none of them imagined that the company they worked for was already beginning to slip. None of the parents pressing through those aisles, arms full of toys, believed that this store, this particular store, this place that had been here as long as they could remember, would one day be gone. But the forces that would end KB Toys were already in motion. They were just moving quietly, the way the worst things always do. Beneath the noise, beneath the lights, beneath the sound of children who did not yet know that anything was wrong. The trouble did not arrive all at once. It never does. The things that destroy institutions rarely announce themselves. They accumulate, slowly, quietly, in the margins of quarterly reports and the gradual shift of consumer habits, until the day that what seemed like pressure reveals itself to have been, all along, a collapse in progress. For KB Toys, the pressure began in earnest in the early 1990s, and it came from two directions at once. The first was Walmart. By the late 1980s, Walmart had already transformed American retail in ways that most competitors had failed to fully reckon with. Its supply chain was unlike anything the industry had seen, a logistics operation so efficient, so relentlessly optimized that it could sell products at prices no specialty retailer could match without destroying its own margins. And Walmart had made a strategic decision about toys that would prove devastating for every dedicated toy retailer in the country. Toys were not a profit center for Walmart. They were a loss leader. The logic was cold and effective. Sell toys at or near cost, sometimes below it, during the holiday season. Take the loss on the toys. Make it up on everything else the family buys while they are in the store. The groceries, the clothing, the household goods, the pharmacy items. Drag the customer through the door with the promise of the cheapest Barbie in town, and let the store do the rest. KB Toys could not play that game. KB Toys sold only toys. There was no grocery aisle to subsidize a price war, no pharmacy to absorb the loss. Every dollar KB discounted from a toy price was a dollar taken directly from its margin, with nothing to replace it. When Walmart put a Hot Wheels set on sale for prices that KB could not match, parents noticed. They drove past the mall. They went to Walmart instead. Target was doing the same thing. The big box model, vast stores, low prices, everything under one roof, was rewriting the rules of retail in ways that mall-based specialty stores were structurally unable to answer. The second pressure was the mall itself. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the American shopping mall had been the dominant engine of retail commerce. It was where people went, not just to shop, but to be, to walk, to eat, to see, and be seen. The mall was a community space as much as a commercial one, and KB Toys had built its entire existence around that reality. But by the mid-1990s, mall traffic was beginning to soften. The causes were multiple and reinforcing. Big box retailers on the outskirts of town were pulling customers away from the mall corridor. Suburban sprawl was pushing new development further from the older mall locations. And a new technology, still early, still slow, still navigated by a minority of households, was beginning to suggest that shopping might one day not require leaving the house at all. The internet would take years to fully reshape retail, but the direction of travel was visible to anyone willing to look. KB's management looked and launched kbkids.com in 1998. It was a reasonable response to an obvious trend, but the website required investment, infrastructure, technology, fulfillment capacity, at precisely the moment when the core brick-and-mortar business was already feeling the strain of price competition it could not win. Then came Consolidated Stores Corporation. In 1996, Melville Corporation, which had owned KB since 1981 and grown it into a national chain, sold the brand to Consolidated Stores for approximately $300 million. At the time, KB operated more than 1,000 locations. Consolidated was a closeout retailer, a company built on the logic of buying excess merchandise cheap and selling it cheaper. It understood discount, it understood volume. What it did not fully understand, or did not sufficiently respect, was the particular character of what KB Toys had built. Under Consolidated, the expansion continued even as the competitive environment darkened. More stores opened. The footprint grew. But growth, in a business already under margin pressure from Walmart and Target, was not a solution. It was an amplification of the problem. Every new store was another lease, another payroll, another set of fixed costs in a market where the prices KB could charge were being pushed relentlessly downward by competitors who did not need the toy department to turn a profit. The executives who made these decisions were not reckless men. They were operating inside the logic of their industry as they understood it. More stores meant more revenue, more presence, more relevance. The playbook that had built KB Toys through the 1970s and 1980s had not yet been formally declared obsolete, but it was. And the employees working the floors of those 1,300 stores, the seasonal workers, the store managers, the regional supervisors who had spent their careers inside this company, were beginning to feel it in ways that no earnings call would accurately reflect. Hours were trimmed. Staffing ran thin. The restocking that used to happen overnight sometimes didn't happen at all. Little things. The kind of little things that, taken together, mean something larger, is wrong. By the time 1999 arrived, the year KB Toys hit its peak of 1,324 stores and $1.8 billion in revenue, the company was already standing on ground that had begun to shift beneath it. The numbers looked strong. The momentum looked real. But the worst decision in KB Toys' history had not yet been made. That was still coming. And the men who would make it were already circling. In December 2000, a private equity firm based in Boston completed the purchase of KB Toys for $305 million. The firm was Bain Capital. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what a leveraged buyout actually is, because the mechanics of the transaction matter as much as the name of the buyer. In a leveraged buyout, the acquiring firm does not pay the full purchase price with its own money. It borrows heavily, using the target company's own assets as collateral. The debt does not sit on the private equity firm's balance sheet. It sits on the company being acquired. KB Toys, in other words, did not just get a new owner in December 2000. It got a new owner and a mountain of debt it had not previously carried. Debt that would require servicing every month, every quarter, every year, regardless of whether the toy market was strong or weak, regardless of whether Walmart was cutting prices, regardless of whether the malls were full or half empty. This is the structure that private equity applies to acquisitions across industries. Sometimes it works. The new owners bring operational discipline, strategic focus, and the resources to invest in a turnaround. The debt gets paid down. The company emerges stronger. That is not what happened here. What happened here was faster and simpler, and considerably more damaging. In 2002, just 2 years after the acquisition, while KB Toys was already struggling to compete against Walmart's price wars and absorb the cost of its debt load, Bain Capital and its partners executed a dividend recapitalization. The company took on additional bank loans and used the proceeds to pay its investors a dividend of approximately $85 million. Of that sum, roughly $66 million was funded not by KB Toys' profits. The company was not generating the kind of profits that would support an $85 million payout, but by new debt layered onto the existing debt. The people who ran the stores did not receive that dividend. The seasonal workers who restocked shelves at midnight did not receive it. The store managers who had spent their careers inside this company did not receive it. The $85 million went to the investors who had purchased KB Toys 2 years earlier, drawn from borrowed money that KB Toys itself would now be obligated to repay. 2 years after the acquisition, KB Toys owed more than it had owed on the day Bain bought it. It was generating less revenue than it needed to service that debt. And the competitive environment, Walmart, Target, the early stirrings of e-commerce, was not improving. The math was not complicated. The outcome was not difficult to predict. On January 14, 2004, KB Toys filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company's own filings cited the cause plainly: a brutal holiday price war in the Christmas season of 2003. driven by Walmart's decision to slash toy prices to levels that specialty retailers could not match. Sales had collapsed during what should have been the most profitable weeks of the year. The debt that might have been manageable in a strong revenue environment became, in the wreckage of that Christmas season, something the company could no longer carry. More than 600 stores closed in the months that followed. 3,500 jobs were eliminated. The KB Toys that emerged from bankruptcy in 2005 was a diminished version of its former self, fewer than 600 stores, a reduced workforce, a brand that had lost the confidence of its vendors, its landlords, and, slowly, its customers. It is important to be accurate about what Bain Capital did and did not do. Bain did not invent the problems that KB Toys faced. The company was already under pressure from big-box competitors before the acquisition. The structural disadvantages of mall-based specialty retail were already visible. A fair accounting acknowledges that KB Toys was a troubled company when Bain bought it, and that Walmart's price wars would have damaged any toy specialty retailer, regardless of who owned it. But a fair accounting also acknowledges this. At the precise moment when KB Toys needed capital to invest in its stores, to rebuild its competitive position, to fund the e-commerce platform that the market was beginning to demand, the financial structure imposed by its new owners was pulling money out, not putting money in. The $85 million dividend of 2002 was not an investment in KB Toys' future. It was a withdrawal from a company that could not afford to make it. The debt did not cause every problem KB Toys had, but it made every problem harder to solve. In 2005, a new private equity firm, Prentice Capital Management, operating through an affiliate called PKBT Funding, acquired KB Toys out of bankruptcy. Bain's tenure was over. A new ownership group took the wheel of a company that had just closed more than half its stores and shed thousands of employees. There were people inside KB Toys who believed the worst was behind them. The bankruptcy had been painful, but it had also cleared away some of the debt. The store count had been rationalized. The company that remained was smaller, but perhaps more sustainable. They were not wrong to hope, but they were wrong about what was coming. Because the forces that had damaged KB Toys, Walmart's pricing power, the slow erosion of mall traffic, the rising tide of online retail, had not paused during the bankruptcy proceedings. They had continued, quietly and steadily, to reshape the landscape that KB Toys needed to survive in. And the company that emerged from bankruptcy in 2005 was not the company that had entered it. Something had changed, not just in the balance sheet, not just in the store count, but in the confidence of the people who worked there, and in the loyalty of the customers who had once made KB Toys a fixture of their family life. Trust, once damaged, is a slow thing to rebuild. KB Toys did not have slow time. It had no time at all. The spiral that would end the company had already begun. Most of the people inside it simply had not yet understood how little runway remained. There is a particular kind of institutional dying that does not happen all at once. It happens in quarters, in announcements, in the gradual accumulation of small losses that individually seem survivable and collectively do not. The people inside the institution feel it before the numbers confirm it, in the way management stops making long-term plans, in the way conversations about the future grow shorter and vaguer, in the way nobody talks anymore about where the company will be in 5 years, because everyone has quietly stopped believing there will be a company in 5 years. This is what KB Toys felt like between 2005 and 2008. Prentice Capital Management had acquired a company with fewer than 600 stores, a workforce that had already absorbed one round of devastating cuts, and a brand that was still recognizable but no longer dominant. The new owners made operational changes. They attempted to reposition the remaining stores. They tried to differentiate KB from the big box competitors that had already taken so much of its market. But the structural problem had not changed. KB Toys was a mall-based specialty toy retailer in an era when mall traffic was declining, when Walmart and Target were pricing toys as loss leaders, and when a growing number of American families were beginning to buy Christmas gifts from a website rather than a store. Each of these forces was damaging on its own. Together, they were relentless. By 2007, KB operated fewer than 600 stores, less than half the footprint it had maintained at its peak 8 years earlier. The Washington Post, reporting on the company's condition that November, quoted a retail analyst who used a phrase that lodged itself in the public record like a diagnosis. KB Toys, he said, was in a death spiral. Not struggling, not challenged. A death spiral, the language of a system that has passed the point where intervention can reverse the trajectory. The stores that remained were showing the strain. Inventory levels were thinner than they had once been. Restocking was slower. The product mix that had once made KB stores feel dense and abundant, that sense of walking into a room packed with everything a child could want, was harder to maintain on a budget that kept contracting. Customers noticed. Not always consciously, not in a way they could have articulated, but in the way that shoppers always notice when a store has begun to let itself go. The people who worked in those stores noticed something else. Consider the arc of a KB Toys employee in those final years. Not a named individual, because the historical record does not preserve their names, but a composite drawn from the reality of what retail workers in a failing chain experience. A woman, perhaps, who had come to KB in the mid-1990s as a part-time Christmas hire, liked the work, and stayed. Over 12 years, she had become a shift supervisor, someone who knew the seasonal rhythms of the business the way a farmer knows weather, the August lull, the September back-to-school push, the controlled chaos of the post-Thanksgiving rush, the long exhale of January returns. She had worked through the first bankruptcy. She had watched colleagues lose jobs in the store closures of 2004, and told herself that the worst was over, that what remained was the viable core, that the company would find its footing. By 2007, she was no longer telling herself that. The signs were not dramatic. They were mundane, which made them worse. Corporate communications that used to be detailed and forward-looking had become brief and non-committal. District managers who had once visited monthly were now appearing quarterly, and when they came, they spent more time reviewing costs than talking about growth. The holiday staffing budget, once the clearest signal of how much faith corporate had in the season, was tighter than she had ever seen it. She was being asked to do more with less, in a store that needed more, not less, to compete with the Walmart 2 miles down the road that never seemed to run out of anything. She had children of her own. She had built her schedule, her income, her family's financial stability around this job. And she was beginning to do the arithmetic that workers in failing companies always eventually do, quietly, privately, in the space between closing out the register and walking to her car in the mall parking lot. She was beginning to calculate how bad it was going to get. Then 2008 arrived. The financial crisis that swept through the American economy in the fall of 2008 was not the cause of KB Toys' collapse. The company was already dying. But the crisis was the accelerant that turned a slow deterioration into a final, unrecoverable plunge. Consumer confidence collapsed. Discretionary spending froze. Families that might have stretched their holiday budgets in a stronger economy pulled back sharply. And when they did spend on toys, they went where prices were lowest. Walmart, Target, Amazon, which by 2008 had become a genuine force in holiday retail. KB Toys had no answer for any of this. It had spent the previous 3 years trying to stabilize a company that the market had already decided it did not need. It was carrying lease obligations on hundreds of mall locations, at a moment when mall traffic had fallen to levels that made those leases unsustainable. It was competing on price against retailers for whom toys were a secondary category, which meant competitors who could always afford to go lower. And it was doing all of this while the broader American economy was contracting at a speed not seen since the Great Depression. The 2008 holiday season was supposed to be the season that proved KB Toys could survive. New promotions, aggressive markdowns, a final attempt to remind American families why they had loved this store for 30 years. The families came, some of them. They took the markdowns, they bought at the discounted prices. But the margins those sales generated were not enough to cover what the company owed, and what it owed was due regardless of how many toys moved off the shelves. In the back offices and the conference calls that employees were not invited to attend, the people who held KB Toys' debt were reaching the end of their patience. The numbers that came in from October and November 2008 were not the numbers that a company in crisis needs to survive a crisis. They were the numbers of a company that had already lost. The woman who had worked those Christmas shifts for 12 years did not know yet what was coming, but she felt it. in the quiet that had settled over the district manager's visits, in the way nobody at corporate would give a straight answer about the spring merchandise order, in the particular stillness that gathers around an institution in its final weeks. December was coming, and December, for the last time in KB Toys history, was going to be unlike any December that had come before. December 11th, 2008 was a Thursday. Outside, the holiday season was in full motion. Mall parking lots across the country were filling with a particular urgent set of families who had 14 days left before Christmas morning and lists that were not yet finished. The music that plays in American retail spaces every December, the same songs year after year, inescapable and oddly comforting, was moving through the corridors of every shopping center where KB Toys still had a store. 14 shopping days. The most important 2 weeks of the retail year. It was on this day that KB Toys filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time. Not in January. Not after the season, when the returns were processed and the markdowns were done, and there was at least the dignity of having made it through Christmas. On December 11th, with the holiday lights still on and the shelves still stocked and the seasonal workers, the 6,500 people hired specifically for this season, many of them working their first shifts of the year, still showing up for their schedules, still believing there was a season left to work. The filing was not a surprise to everyone. The people who tracked KB Toys' debt, who read the covenant disclosures and the quarterly filings and the analyst notes that had been calling this company a death spiral for more than a year, they had seen it coming. But for the employees in 461 stores across 44 states, in Guam and Puerto Rico, for the shift supervisors and the stock clerks and the assistant managers who had driven to work that Thursday morning thinking about inventory counts and register assignments, the announcement arrived the way these announcements always arrive at the store level, without warning, without explanation, with a piece of paper and a set of instructions. The instructions were specific. Going out of business sales would begin immediately. All sales were final. No returns, no exchanges, no rain checks. The stores would remain open, not to serve customers in the way KB Toys had served customers for 30 years, but to liquidate, to convert merchandise into cash with maximum efficiency and minimum sentiment. Gordon Brothers, a liquidation firm, would manage the process. The goal was not to save the company was already gone. The goal was to extract whatever value remained from the shelves and the fixtures and the inventory before the leases expired and the lights went out for the last time. Signs went up in the windows, going out of business, all sales final, up to 50% off. Across the country, in malls from Maine to California, those signs appeared in the windows of KB Toys stores within days of the filing. And something happened that the liquidators understood perfectly well, and that corporate retail always counts on in its final moments. The customers came. They came because the prices were low. They came because a toy store going out of business in the 2 weeks before Christmas is a particular kind of opportunity that American consumers are trained to recognize. They came with lists and with carts and with children in tow, and they cleaned the shelves with a thoroughness that no normal holiday season ever quite achieved. And the employees watched them do it. The woman who had worked those Christmas shifts for 12 years was still there. She had not quit when the filing was announced, though some of her colleagues had. People who had other options, people who could not bear to stand behind a register while strangers picked through the store like it was already dead. She stayed because she needed the paycheck through the end of the season, and because some part of her, the part that had given 12 years to this company, felt that leaving now would be a kind of abandonment she was not ready to commit. She worked the floor during the going out of business sales. She answered the same questions hundreds of times. Can I use a gift card? No. Can I return something I bought last week? No. Do you know what's going to happen to this location? No. She smiled when she could. She was professional when smiling was too much to ask. At night, after her shift, she sat in her car in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving home. Not because she was too tired to drive, because the parking lot was the only place left where she could be neither inside the store nor away from it. Suspended between what this job had been and what it was now becoming. Her last paycheck would carry her into January. After that, she did not know. Christmas came and went without ceremony for the people who worked what remained of KB Toys. There was no company party. There were no bonuses. There were no messages from corporate thanking the employees for their service during the holiday season, because the people sending such messages had other concerns. The seasonal workers who had signed on in November for a Christmas job received their hours through the end of the liquidation period and were then released, most of them without benefits, without severance, without the kind of formal farewell that a decade or more of service might reasonably warrant. The stores kept selling, the shelves kept emptying. By late January, the merchandise was thin, the popular items long gone, the remainder marked down to prices that reflected their status as the last things anyone wanted. Bare shelves appeared in sections that had once been packed. The fluorescent lights that had hummed over those shelves for years now illuminated empty metal fixtures and the faint rectangular shadows on the walls where display signs had hung. Then, one by one, in the order determined by the liquidation schedule, the stores closed. Not with ceremony, not with speeches. With a final transaction, a final count of the register, a final walk through a space that had been stripped of everything that had made it what it was. The fixtures were tagged for sale or removal. The signage came down. The employees who had worked the last shifts collected their personal belongings, whatever small things people accumulate in a workplace over months and years, a phone charger, a coffee mug, a photograph kept in a drawer, and walked out through the doors for the last time. In some stores, longtime employees stood in the parking lot afterward, not quite ready to leave. There was nothing ceremonial about it. No one had organized a farewell. It was simply that the body resists finality, that people who have spent years inside a place find it difficult to walk away from it in the same motion as leaving a shift. They stood for a while, then they got in their cars and drove home. On February 9th, 2009, KB Toys ceased to exist as an operating company. 461 stores, gone. 10,850 employees, the number recorded in the bankruptcy filing, the number that represents paychecks and health insurance and family budgets and career plans, compressed into a single statistic that tells you the scale of what was lost without telling you anything about what it felt like. 87 years of American retail history, from a wholesale candy store in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, to a national institution that had put a toy in the hands of 3 generations of American children. Gone in a Thursday morning filing in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. The brand and the trademarks, the name, the logo, the intellectual property that remained after everything physical had been liquidated, were sold 9 months later to Toys R Us for $2.1 million. $2.1 million for 87 years of brand equity, for the name that had meant something to every child who had ever pressed their face against a mall window and dreamed. Toys R Us, which bought what remained of KB Toys in September 2009, would itself file for bankruptcy 8 years later in 2017, burdened by the same private equity debt logic that had helped destroy the company it had just acquired. The men who had extracted the money were long gone by then. The stores were already silent. The stores did not become anything else right away. That is the part that the before and after narratives of retail collapse tend to skip. The interval between closing and replacement, the period when a space that was once full of noise and light and commerce sits empty behind dark glass, a rectangular void in the mall corridor that foot traffic routes around without quite looking at. In the months after KB Toys closed, that void appeared in malls across the country. Hundreds of them. The signage was gone, the shelves were gone, the fixtures were gone, and what remained was a bare concrete floor and the ghost of a floor plan, and, in some locations, the faint outline on the carpet where the gondola units had stood for so many years that the fabric beneath them had been protected from foot traffic and remained a shade brighter than everything around it. The shape of a toy store, preserved in carpet fiber, that was what KB Toys left behind in the immediate aftermath. For the malls that had depended on KB as an anchor tenant, and there were many, particularly in smaller markets where KB had been the only dedicated toy retailer for miles, the closure was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a sequence. When a mid-size mall loses a reliable traffic generator, the consequences move through the remaining tenants the way a fracture moves through load-bearing material. The shoe store that had counted on the foot traffic from families coming to KB now found its own numbers softening. The card shop next door, the pretzel stand at the corridor intersection, the small clothing boutique that had located itself near KB precisely because of the family demographic it attracted. All of them felt the absence. Some of them closed within a year, Others held on longer but never recovered the volume they had known when KB was operating next door. In communities where the mall itself was already struggling, and by 2009, a significant number of American malls were struggling, the KB Toys closure was sometimes the event that tipped a fragile equilibrium into visible decline. Dead storefronts multiplied. The anchor department stores that had once defined the mall's identity began reassessing their own leases. The food courts thinned out. The parking lots, which had once filled on Saturday mornings with the particular optimism of American consumer life, began to show their age. The American mall did not die because KB Toys closed, but KB Toys closing was a symptom of the same disease that was killing the mall, and when the symptom became visible in hundreds of locations simultaneously, it accelerated the decline it reflected. The human arithmetic of the closure was harder to tabulate than the real estate consequences, but no less real. More than 10,000 people lost their jobs when KB Toys ceased operations in February 2009. The majority of them were part-time workers, women largely, many of them mothers, many of them in their 30s and 40s, for whom the KB paycheck had been a supplement to a household income that needed supplementing. For the full-time employees, the store managers, the regional supervisors, the people who had built careers inside this company, the loss was more severe and the recovery more difficult. Retail management experience does not transfer easily in a contracting retail environment. The managers who had run KB Toys stores in 2008 entered a job market in 2009 that was shedding retail jobs across the board. Some found positions with other chains. Some took work in adjacent industries, warehouse logistics, customer service, sales. Some did not find equivalent work for years. Some never did. The woman who had worked those Christmas shifts for 12 years found another job eventually. Retail, again, because retail was what she knew. The pay was lower. The hours were less predictable. The company she worked for was smaller, and she was aware, in a way she had not been before 2009, of how quickly the ground could shift beneath a business that seemed permanent. She did not press her face against toy store windows anymore, but sometimes, in a mall, passing the space where something used to be, she would slow her pace almost imperceptibly, the way people do when they pass a place that meant something to them once and that the world has since repurposed or erased. The brand itself passed through several hands after February 2009. Toys R Us held the intellectual property until its own bankruptcy in 2017. A brand revival company called Strategic Marks acquired the name in 2016 and announced plans to reopen KB Toys stores in 2019. The funding never materialized. The stores never opened. As of 2024, the KB Toys name is held by an entity called the Firefly Brand Management Partnership. There are no stores. There is only the name, and whatever the name still means to the people who remember what it used to be attached to. Go back to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Go back to the far western corner of the state, tucked against the Berkshire Hills, where two brothers opened a candy store on April 1st, 1922, because that was what they knew how to do, and where the accident of an unpaid debt sent them into a business they had never planned for and could not have imagined would one day reach every corner of the country. The headquarters building at 100 West Street is still there. The Berkshire Hills are still there. The town is still there, smaller than it once was, quieter than it once was, the kind of New England mill city that the second half of the 20th century was not kind to. The factories that gave Pittsfield its identity, the paper mills, the General Electric plant that employed thousands for decades, are mostly gone now, part of the same long industrial retreat that reshaped so much of working-class America in the years between 1970 and 2010. KB Toys fits that story. It is part of that retreat. What KB Toys was, at its best, was not complicated. It was a store, a small store, usually. 2,000 square feet, maybe 3,000, carved out of a mall corridor between a shoe shop and a greeting card outlet. The ceilings were low, the aisles were narrow, the shelves were packed with the particular density of a business that had learned to make every square foot earn its keep. But inside that store, something happened that no balance sheet ever captured, and no bankruptcy filing ever adequately reflected. Children discovered things they wanted. Parents found gifts that would become memories. Families spent 20 minutes on a Saturday afternoon that would, decades later, surface in the mind unbidden. The smell of new plastic packaging, the particular weight of a boxed board game, the moment a child spotted something on a high shelf and pointed and looked up at a parent with an expression that required no words. That is what was lost in February 2009. Not a retailer, not a chain, not a set of mall leases and vendor contracts and brand trademarks that eventually sold for $2.1 million. A place where American childhood happened. The generation that grew up with KB toys is in its 50s and 60s now. The children who pressed their faces against those windows in 1978 and 1985 and 1991 are the parents and grandparents of children who have never seen a KB Toys store and never will. The toys those children wanted, the Star Wars figures, the Barbie play sets, the Hot Wheels tracks, the board games that sat under Christmas trees and defined the particular texture of a December morning. Those toys are in attics now, in donation boxes, in the careful collections of people who understand that objects carry memory the way nothing else quite does. The malls where KB Toys lived are quieter now. Some of them are gone entirely, demolished, converted, left to deteriorate behind fences that were supposed to be temporary. Others survive in reduced form, half their storefronts dark, the foot traffic a fraction of what it was when KB Toys was there to draw it. There are no KB Toys stores anywhere in the country. There is no store to press your face against. There is only the memory of the glass and the light behind it, and the sense, vivid and specific and irretrievable, of being a child in America at a moment when a particular kind of ordinary happiness was still possible, still affordable, still waiting for you at the end of a mall corridor on a Saturday afternoon. That moment is gone. The store closed, and it did not come back.